ever clashed. That every human being in this country is now, whether he or she likes it, at the service of the government to work in the defence of Australia.
So on December the 8th, 1941, the new Prime Minister of Australia, John Curtin, is woken up by a staffer to the most dreaded news. Japan has bombed Pearl Harbor, declared war on America, and is advancing southward to build its empire and squeeze America before their industrial advantage comes into effect. If you missed last week, Curtin became the Prime Minister by the narrowest of margins. After the 1940 election, two independents held the balance of power. Initially, they sided with Robert Menzies' United Australia Party, but defected to form government with John Curtin's Labour after the UAP knifed Menzies as their leader. Curtin had supported Menzies in declaring war on Germany, but now Curtin faced a much tougher prospect, preventing Australia from falling to Imperial Japan. And it's for Australia's success against the Japanese that Curtin is remembered as our best ever Prime Minister. And by the end of the video, you'll be in a position where you can weigh that one up for yourself. So after watching, comment below if you think Curtin truly is Australia's best ever Prime Minister, or if someone else deserves that title. Also, like the video if you find it helpful, and subscribe so you don't miss a single chapter of the only series on the web covering the complete history of Federated Australia. Now, Australia had never before had to fight a war of defence, and the grim reality was that they didn't actually have the available divisions to repel Japan. As Curtin looked at the map, there also wasn't a clear part of the Asia Pacific that he felt he could get troops to in time to turn around Japan. As a result, his main hope was that the British could stop them at Singapore. Churchill had boasted that it was an impenetrable fortress, and it contained significant ships such as the Prince of Wales. Curtin warned Britain that this was Australia's darkest hour, and to continue as a secure part of the Commonwealth, it needed Britain's full assurance that it would defend Singapore. What was also interesting is that Curtin directly declared war with Japan. Previously, Australia had declared war through Britain, such as against Hitler and in World War I. Curtin meant business and would prioritise the war against Japan with or without the help of the British. Now, the chronology of Japan's advance can sometimes get a little confusing, but to put it in simple terms, within 6 months they got from Indochina to Papua New Guinea. Now, this caught the Allies completely off guard, largely due to their arrogance. In fact, I remember reading a section in Ian Toll's Pacific Crucible where he wrote about there being a genuine belief in the American military that the tilted eyes of Japanese pilots gave them worse depth perception. So Japan rapidly advanced through the Malayan jungle. Their soldiers were much more capable jungle fighters than Britain, and by the end of 1941, they were on the doorstep of Singapore, and they even sank the Prince of Wales. Suffice to say that Curtin was freaking out and was furious at Churchill for not heeding his warning. Forewarning, if you're Aussie, Churchill's really going to trigger you today. So on December the 27th, 1941, a couple of weeks after Pearl Harbor, John Curtin made a speech that indicated Australia was ready to instead pivot to America for help. Britain had only colonial interests in the Pacific, whereas America was literally attacked by Japan. In this speech, Curtin declared that without any inhibitions of any kind, I make it quite clear that Australia looks to America, free of any pangs to our traditional links or kinship with the UK. Churchill was furious at this and denounced Curtin as insulting the war effort, and even threatened to go over Curtin's head and make a direct broadcast to the Australian people. Now, last week we saw Menzies also get really angry at Churchill for his neglect of Australian interests, but now with Japan at play, Curtin wasn't going to roll over to Churchill like Menzies had. So in January of 1942, Churchill was resigned to letting Singapore be taken, even though he'd earlier claimed that it was impenetrable. And his priority was to now defend Burma to stop the Japanese from advancing towards India. And this was reason alone to annoy Curtin. Churchill had literally shown his hand in that he was more concerned about westward expansion towards India than southward towards Australia. But to make matters worse, Britain's commander of the Far East, Archibald Wavell, wrote a report to London which referenced the indiscipline of Australian soldiers abandoning their post and deserting their British commanders. Churchill then used this report to blame Australia for the defeat, attributing the fall of Singapore to Aussie cowardice. There was one slight issue with this though. The Australian 8th Division suffered 73% of the Allied casualties, but only made up 13% of the Allied forces in Singapore. Yes, some soldiers deserted, but Australian soldiers were dying at much greater rates than British soldiers, and were then blamed for being cowards. Now, something you should know about Curtin was that he suffered from depression and alcoholism dating back to the 1910s. Unsurprisingly, stress triggered both of these, and by February of 1942, he was in hospital with gastritis, inflammation of the stomach lining often caused by excessive drinking. At the same time, Japan bombed Australian airfields in Darwin, killing 236. The war had now well and truly come to Australia. But Churchill isn't done annoying you just yet. You see, Churchill wanted control of Australia's 2 Middle Eastern divisions who had been fighting against Rommel. Churchill's plan was to send one of those divisions to Burma. Again, look at the map. This would have helped Britain defend westward expansion towards India, but would have done nothing to help defend Australia. Churchill sent his request to Curtin, but didn't hear back straight away. While awaiting Curtin's reply, Churchill unilaterally ordered the ships with Aussie soldiers towards Burma. When Curtin caught wind, he angrily demanded them to be redirected towards Australia. In fact, Curtin was so anxious that he actually couldn't sleep as they crossed the Indian Ocean. The war would well and truly take its toll on him. Now, because I'm not making this video in Japanese, I'm sure it's no spoiler to tell you that Japan didn't actually invade Australia. But before we look at how Japan was halted in the Pacific, we have to look at the home front because that's Curtin's main sphere of influence. Basically, Curtin's effectiveness was in his ability to galvanise Australia and encourage them to make pretty big civic sacrifices for the war effort. His main message that he repeated was that ordinary Australians had the chance to emulate the heroics of the soldiers at sea and in the jungle by making sacrifices at home. In terms of the economy, wages, prices and rent were all fixed, while commodities like eggs, butter and clothes were all rationed. In an effort to incentivise farmers, Curtin also guaranteed them that the government would buy anything they produced. The government also introduced industrial conscription and increased munitions factories from 2 in 1939 to 32 in 1943, though Menzies deserves credit for this too. Finally, a lasting effect of Curtin's war effort was income tax. So from 1900 to 1915, all income tax was paid to the state government. However, in order to support the war effort in World War I, Hughes introduced a federal income tax, and from 1915 to 1942, all Australians were paying both state and federal income tax. Deeming this inefficient and not helpful in the war effort, Curtin scrapped the state tax, leaving the feds as the only ones receiving income tax. After the war, the states didn't return to levying income tax. Another interesting area of homefront policy was to do with censorship. During 1945, the Australian government gave an average of 8 instructions to the press, usually to do with things like strikes and anti-Britain protests. Australia's Supreme Commander in the Southwest Pacific, Douglas MacArthur, approved of Australia doing this and often gave inaccurate information to the Australian press under the guise of keeping morale high. Interestingly, the official death toll of the Darwin bombs was reported as being 17 when it was nearly 250. The government thought that accurate reporting would lower morale, but later came to realise that it actually had the effect of galvanising Australia. There was also an internal divide within Labour as to where conscripts could be sent. As we're about to see, Japan had advanced towards Port Moresby, the capital of the then Australian colony of Papua. With conscripts only being compelled to serve within Australian territory, could Australia end up in a situation where the conscript forces had to stop when the Japanese were repelled back towards Dutch New Guinea? The opposition saw this as a chance to capitalise. Also, how crazy is this? When Menzies was knifed and the UAP went into opposition, have a guess who they chose as their leader? Billy Hughes, Australia's Prime Minister during World War I. You see, Hughes had defected from Labour to form the Nationalist Party because Labour wouldn't support him in introducing foreign conscription. Accordingly, he championed the conscription cause once again, whereas Curtin agreed to limit the areas conscript soldiers could go. In 1943, Australia went to the polls once again, and Labour received a dominant win, claiming decisive victory in both houses. The UAP dumped Hughes to bring back Menzies as its leader, and it would then once again rebrand to become the Liberal Party. Just as a quick reminder, the Protectionists and Free Traders merged to become the Liberals in 1909. Then in 1917, the Liberals and Nationalist Labour merged to become the Nationalists. Then in 1931, the Nationalists merged with Joseph Lyons and a handful of other Labour defectors to become the UAP. Then in 1945, they became the Liberal Party that we know today. Though knifed by his own, Menzies' career was far from over. So to go back to 1942, Japan was rapidly advancing towards Australia, and Curtin pivoted away from the UK and towards the US for support. He firstly recalled General Thomas Blamey from the Middle East, and as he was doing that, President Roosevelt appointed Douglas MacArthur as the Supreme Allied Commander of the Southwest Pacific. MacArthur said to Curtin, "You take care of the rear, and I'll handle the front." The plan was to repel Japan just north of Australia and use the mainland as a recovery base for exhausted soldiers. MacArthur had developed a cult of personality around himself, and so his presence gave a huge morale boost to Australia. Curtin iconically said, "We will trade punches with Japan until we rock the enemy back on his heels." Now, by the middle of 1942, the threat of Japanese invasion started to dissipate. Firstly, in May, the Battle of the Coral Sea was a stalemate, but it was the first time the Japanese Navy was prevented from advancing. Then in June, the Battle of Midway saw America sink 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, and Japan lost many of their skilled pilots. From 1942 to 1943, America would take back the island of Guadalcanal and the Solomons, and Australia's 39th Battalion would repel the Japanese at New Guinea, famously pushing the Japanese back along the Kokoda track. Now, you can watch an entire video I made on the battle here, but basically, MacArthur tried to rob the Aussies of the glory in the battle. He ordered American troops to finish off the Japanese at Buna, that's North New Guinea, but they failed to do this and the Australians had to be recalled. This raised some alarm bells to Curtin about how America would end up treating the Aussies. From 1943 onwards, the Japanese were gradually pushed back all the way home. However, because they lost their best pilots in Midway, the kamikaze pilot was introduced. Many Japanese signed up to die the samurai warrior's honourable death, and this meant that every advance Australia and America made came with devastating losses. The Japanese were trying to wreak havoc to force a negotiated settlement, but Curtin and Roosevelt were adamant on unconditional surrender. Concerned with how America would treat them, Curtin and New Zealand's Prime Minister Peter Fraser signed the Anzac Agreement in 1944 to try and limit the spread of US influence to north of the equator. To try and patch up UK relations, Curtin also appointed the King's brother as Australia's Governor-General, though Curtin retained his personal disdain for Churchill. In April of 1945, Roosevelt actually died and Harry Truman assumed the position of president. Then in May of 1945, the Nazis surrendered and the Allies had Japan on their doorstep. They had control of the Marianas, Iwo Jima, and nearly Okinawa, and bombing raids were being conducted from those islands. Strategic bombing destroyed the industrial cities, while firebombing wreaked havoc on the wooden Japanese houses in an effort to turn them against their government. Now in 1944, Curtin had suffered a heart attack, but recovered by the beginning of 1945. In July of 1945, he had a second heart attack, attributed to yes, his alcohol consumption, but also the stress of the war. Attendants rushed to his aid at the lodge, but it became apparent he wouldn't pull through. At the age of 60, on July the 5th, 1945, Curtin died. Japan was just 6 weeks away from surrender. Thanks for watching. Let me know below, is Curtin truly deserving of the title of Australia's best ever Prime Minister? Next week, we look at Ben Chifley's response to the end of the war and watch him take on the resurgent Robert Menzies. Make sure to like the video and subscribe if you haven't already, and consider supporting us on Patreon for as little as a 10-pack of chicken goujons. We can't wait to see you next time for our next venture into a fascinating part of history.